just the scale of the activity, the expansion, the development, the energy, the fact that Saudi Arabia truly is rocking so many sectors of international trade, sports, politics, energy. I just can't even begin to put into words the colossal change that I've been able to see in these 30 years. It's really, really hard for anybody who's not experienced that to understand how it's gone from a place that was really very important from an Islamic standpoint, but so unknown to most of the planet. And here we are with the podcast, the most listened to in the English language, beginning with the area code that was once dialing in to speak to me. Marvelous.
This is the 966.
This is the 966, episode 94. Mr. Richard Wilson, hello.
Hey, how you doing? How you doing? It's all running on. Each one is distinct and fun and everything, but boy, it's nice when they stack up. So here we go, 94.
94 on July 14th. This will air, Richard. This is really bizarre, but we are now in the second half of 2023, which is kind of hard to wrap one's head around. It's like already midsummer. It's crazy. Wow. Yeah.
Yes, agreed.
And Richard, we have a good one for this week too. We will be speaking soon with British-American Dr. Qanta Ahmed from NYU Langone. And Dr. Qanta wrote a book about her experiences working as a doctor in Saudi Arabia in 2008 and has since traveled there many times since the launch of Vision 2030, seen some of the reforms firsthand for women. Just going to be a really cool conversation, Richard. Looking forward to this one.
Agreed. She first went there in 1999, so she has essentially been doing a longitudinal study of Saudi Arabia, and has some real thoughts and perspective on what it was like then, what's it become now, and it'll be fun. It'll really be really fun to talk with her.
It's going to be great. Richard, we'll also be talking a little bit more about Saudi women and their progress recently and over the last few years, and we will touch on Saudi Arabia's Expo 2030 bid, a lot more as well, as always, in Yallah. And Richard, just always like to start off with a reminder to listeners who haven't subscribed yet to please subscribe on wherever. I mean, we've said this a million times, but there are now so many places to get the 966.
Right.
I think like 29 podcasting platforms, YouTube. You can follow us on LinkedIn now. We're going to start putting up shorter segments there and sort of tease some content on LinkedIn because we get a lot of feedback there anyway. So kind of makes sense to go where the crowd is. Richard got this piece of feedback on YouTube from at Albendari Khalid 4280 5 days ago. Proud of you, Dana. She was referring obviously to our conversation last week. Just received the video. Thanks to your hosts too. I subscribed to their channel. You did very well. Cool. Thank you.
Has it all wrapped in compliments plus a subscription? We can't ask for anything more.
Yeah, that was a good one. I like that one. That had both a compliment and an action, which is great. So thank you, Richard. Shall we?
Shall we? We shall.
What's your one big thing this week?
Thing. As we know, Saudi Arabia is stepping full forward into convening and all sorts of sports events. And we did a segment previously on I think it was a month of February, the number of international exhibits and meetings and that sort of thing that were being held in Riyadh. But anyway, a big one is Saudi Arabia's bid to host the 2030 Expo, World Expo, but it is Expo 2030. So competition is heating up for the right to host the 2030 Expo, World Expo, which is a massive event, as we know. And if everything goes well, it can generate significant revenue, jobs, global attention. It'd be a real coup to get it. So late last month in June, the three competing cities, which are Rome, Riyadh, and South Korea's second biggest city, Busan, presented their bids at a key meeting of the Paris-based Bureau International des Expositions, BIE. The heads of state for all three countries, Italy, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia, were all in France to support their country's bid. Mohammed bin Salman spent a week there. I think he was doing other things, but he was there to support this bid. It should be noted that Odessa in Ukraine submitted a bid for this 2030 Expo prior to Russia's invasion last year. I think they'd like to get it, but their bid was not part of the official presentation. It's unlikely to be successful. Anyway, the vote will be taken later this year in November at the 173rd General Assembly of the BIE. Each of the 179 members will have one secret ballot each. So, let the lobbying begin. This is again, it'll become a very political and, hotly contested affair, I'm sure. Saudi Arabia has allocated $7.8 billion worth of investments for Expo 2030. And the theme, if they should win it, is, quote, the era of change together for a foresighted tomorrow, unquote. You'll be interested in this, Lucien. The actual proposed Expo site would be near the under construction King Salman International Airport, so north of the city. Visitors would access the exhibition site through the Riyadh Metro, obviously, and we've carried a couple of these in the Sustig Review this week. So there's a mock-up of the Expo as sort of what it would look like, and it features 226 show pavilions in a circular shape. Participating countries would be selected flexibly based on their longitude, so the countries from the north and the south would be mixed together. This is to symbolize Saudi Arabia's efforts to enable global collaboration. So, again, I talked about the campaigning that's involved with this, and it's global. Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure what Italy or South Korea are doing, and I'm sure they'll be doing their own campaign. Saudi Arabia will allocate $343 million as part of its program to assist 100 countries participating in the Expo 2030. A financial package will be for assistance in areas such as pavilion construction, maintenance, technology support, travel, and holding events. Interesting. That's an interesting incentive. Vote for us, and we'll help pay for your pavilion. The next World Expo is in 2025. It'll be held in Osaka, Japan. They are anticipating 28 million visitors, 150 countries, and 25 organizations are taking part. You can see if you're getting 28 million visitors, and we saw over 20 million visitors to Doha last year, why it's so attractive. So what are the odds for Saudi Arabia? I don't know. The last six, if you include Japan. So, all right. So 2000 was Germany, 2005, Japan, 2010, China, 2015, Italy, Milan, 2020, UAE, Dubai, 2025, Japan, Osaka. So, I don't know how much weight they put in cycling it, but I'm guessing they don't like to do back to back, although they have done it. So you've had Italy in 2015, the Middle East in 2020, you'll have Asia in 2025. So, where does it go in 2030? I mean, you can go to the Middle East, back to Saudi Arabia. Does it go back to Asia, back to back? North Korea? Does it go to Rome, Italy, who had it in 2015? And Italy, by the way, has hosted a number of World Expos. Anyway, the race is on. It's a big deal. We'll keep tabs on it. Should it come to pass, should Saudi Arabia, win the bid, that's yet another sort of a target date to look forward to, and another goal in terms of building out Saudi Arabia's infrastructure and all the things that would be part of doing a World Expo. And Saudi Arabia would want to do it first rate. So it would be another fascinating aspect of their global coming out, as it were.
Yeah, Richard, great pronunciation there on BIE. Now you see what I deal with as a guy with a French first name all the time, and the preference for the anglicized version of it. Richard, really good. I mean, they have been working on this for a long time. You mentioned they hosted the G20, which was during a pandemic year, a bit of a disappointment for them because they really wanted it to be a bit of a showcase of a changing Riyadh. I thought it was interesting too, and you mentioned a little bit about the investment that they are putting into it, and they plan to put into it. Khaled Al Fallah said in France, when effectively the entire Saudi government was in France for this big pitch, that they would invest $7.8 billion in the Expo, as you said. So they're willing to put up big money. I thought that was a lot of money, but in fact, Rome's bid is the most expensive. It's 10 billion euros, or $10.9 billion that they're putting forward to host the Expo 2030 if they win it. And as you mentioned, Richard, Milan just had it. So they're hoping to have sort of the renaissance that Milan has had since it hosted it in 2015. Milan, had a big turnaround and now is considered increasingly more and more cosmopolitan as a city. In other words, the Expo is a huge boom for whoever gets to host it. And so, these cities it's strange because they compete, they're putting themselves forward and marketing themselves as the best destination. They're also kind of competing with each other. And in any competition, there's going to be, Italy already had it and they had it not that long ago. So you're really going to give it to Rome and after Milan had it. So this is interesting. Like the pursuit of it is interesting. And then if it comes to Riyadh's story is we've had Vision 2030 on the books since 2016. We're actually going to talk about that in a little bit, but what a story that would be. The year of our big plan maturing, 2030 would be when we host the Expo. Like that's a really cool story for Saudi Arabia. I'm rooting for them. Rome is my favorite city on the planet, but I'm still rooting for Riyadh because of the 966 podcast, and it'd be amazing to go to, but yeah. So did you mention, Richard, when this decision gets handed down? Because I know the final round of bidding was, or the, sales pitching, I guess it was, the BIE was a few weeks ago.
Yeah, this November.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So we will be keeping tabs on it. Well, maybe we'll do a little celebratory episode if they get it. But Richard, it's also very cool, and I'm glad you noted that it will be near that new airport. So they're going to have some overlap on the infrastructure development there.
Well, and the Royal Commission for Riyadh City is working on an expansion plan. I mean, it's sort of hand in glove with an expansion that's ongoing anyway. It's also interesting because they are thinking, or they may have put their hat in for the FIFA World Cup in 2030. I think that's probably been moved to 2034 because that just might be too much. But so Saudi Arabia is putting their hat in a lot of different rings. This would be a big win.
Yeah, this would be a big one. It would be a longer sort of, maybe not as much as of a media impact, but be a longer benefit. These things last months. So, the World Cup's only a few weeks long. So
it'd be from October to March if they did it in Saudi, in Riyadh, obviously over the winter months.
Yeah. Well, they also have Riyadh season. So if they're in their 12th or 13th Riyadh season for that would be quite the mashup.
They may set it all aside for this, that'd be a big thing, but it's kind of fun. And you were diplomatic in saying they might, be competing against each other. I think it's hardcore. I think they're going to be, trying to really sway, key countries. Maybe the EU all goes with Rome, maybe the Asia all goes with North Korea. Where does Africa go? Mm-hmm. They all have a vote. It's one vote. So, there'll be a lot of politicking out there. Where's the U.S. and South America go?
Yeah. Probably one of the best books that I've read, Richard, Devil in the White City, about the World's Fair in Chicago and the murder. And it just shows you how old this thing is, and how cool it is. So good for them. And both of us, I feel like, have heard nothing but incredible praise for Dubai's effort in hosting it. A couple of people that I know that went were like, it was really cool.
Yeah.
Inshallah, they get this, Richard.
Inshallah. We'll see in November. Yet another story to follow.
Indeed. Richard, my one big thing this week. So in the Sustig News Review last Thursday or Friday, I probably should have written that down before starting this. I think it was Friday, but the New York Times featured an interview last week, and it was called "What It's Like to Be a Female Tour Guide in Saudi Arabia." And it was, an interview style piece with Fatima Al-Zamam, who introduced visitors from around the world to her country, opened up her own business as a tourist guide. And as the NYT article says, she discusses her favorite sites, driving a pickup truck around, and how her country is changing. And this piece is worth reading. It's kind of an easy read because it's so it's very casual, and it's a Q&A format. It's just like kind of cool and refreshing. But just sort of reading it, Richard, I thought in the moment just how much progress we're seeing in just a few years for Saudi women. It feels cliche to say that now, but it's still striking nonetheless. And just seeing this article And the scene presented here by this article in the paper of record for the United States, and some would argue the world, the New York Times, in my opinion, second to none. It's a Saudi woman, a female entrepreneur in the tourism space, which didn't even exist, giving an interview on the record, getting her picture taken, showing herself driving her truck, talking about her business, the reforms going on in Saudi Arabia, Yallah. It just, I just sort of like was struck by this whole, the look of this piece, you know, how things have really changed. So, and we've had, Richard, the enormous fortune to speak with some really dynamic and ultra capable women on the 966. Last week, of course, Dana Al-Ajlani, who was just terrific. Please go back and listen to that if you have not. Just awesome. A wonderful conversation, just terrific. And Richard, we've had recently as well, Saudi female entrepreneur Sarah bin Laden and Renata Jeffrey. And Richard, we had a lot of Saudi women. I went back and sort of looked at it, and we've had a lot of Saudi women on this program. Ghada Al-Harthi from Barker Langham, Day Al-Daiwan, Center for Development of Urban Design and Planning for Saudi Cities, Fatima Al-Hamlan, who's a terrific consultant at the King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center, Dr. Doa Al-Salah from Mount Sinai, Raghat Fatadeen, Reem Philby, Lina Al-Maina, May Al-Mozani. And just kind of thinking about it, we've had just some really impressive guests, Saudi female guests on this program. Obviously, just a tiny fraction of the larger number of Saudi women out there that are exceptional professionals and human beings. And so just reading that article got me thinking about just the amount of progress in the last 5 or 6 years. We really are seeing real results of the reforms included as part of Vision 2030. And those are positive liberal reforms that are empowering Saudi women, not all at once. They weren't enacted, you know, in 2016, 2017, they sort of gradually phased in, but with a steady tempo that kind of indicated where the ship was heading eventually. And that has caused some cultural and societal shifts as well. And there are many from significant to just noteworthy, but, you know, lifting the ban on women driving, outlawing gender discrimination in the workforce, mandating equal wages, retirement ages, forbidding the dismissal of women from jobs for maternity reasons, criminalizing sexual harassment, loosening the dress code in Saudi Arabia. All of these things, Richard, just started coming in one after the other and really giving women a chance to enter the workforce, and have had a knock-on effect socially as well. Things like unmarried women and men are now allowed to mix together and network together in public. You know, we take those things for granted here in the West, but to have that now means it's a real possibility for Saudi women to network and, you know, explore new job opportunities. And Richard, it's really kind of amazing because women employees made up around 37% now of the labor market in Saudi Arabia in 2022. The number of female Saudis working in the kingdom's private sector, surpassed 900,000 for the first time in May of this year. That's a pretty steady and solid increase. In 2019, for example, women made up 26% of the Saudi workforce, 20% in 2018, and 17.6% in 2017. And I'm going to borrow a little bit of data here from a late 2022 piece from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington by Susan Saikali. And she writes, by the first quarter of 2022, 39% of Saudi women in the private sector held senior and middle management positions. As of March of 2022, about 27.7% of women were working in the education sector and 17.7% in the retail and wholesale sectors. Now, of course, Richard, we, sort of 6 years on into Vision 2030, it's called that because there are expectations of goals being hit by 2030. We have a little time to go, and there is a lot of work left to do for Saudi women, increasingly putting women in the highest positions across the public and private sector. We can expect more progress here. Princess Rima is probably the most popular example, but you also have, and Richard, I got a long list here. I'm going to go through a few of these. There's no way to list them all without this becoming a Amazon audiobook instead of a podcast, but just a few. I mean, Sarah Al-Suhaimi, first Saudi woman to chair the Saudi Arabian Stock Exchange, the first female board member of the Saudi Central Bank, Shaila Al-Rawali. Sorry about the butchering of that. Rania Barnawi, a stem cell researcher, became the first woman from the kingdom to go to space. We discussed that recently as well. Michelle Al-Shamari is the first aerospace engineer woman in the GCC and the first Saudi woman to join NASA. I mean, there's so many here. Another example, not just in the private sector business, but Al Noud Al Ansari became the first Saudi female referee to receive the international badge from FIFA. Anyway, so there's all these firsts coming in. It seems like once a week there's some new first, some new glass ceiling being shattered in Saudi Arabia. And so we keep hearing about that, but it's interesting to see the data behind it showing, yeah, indeed, women are entering the workforces. They are taking new jobs and moving around and have some mobility. So this is just, you know, I mean, it was just kind of like, I saw this and I was like, whoa, this article in the New York Times, I was like, you know, New York Times, Saudi woman driving a truck, running her own business, talking about tourism. Just, it's kind of worth taking stock and saying, wow, like, so this, things are actually changing. It is cliche basically on this podcast to say that, Richard. We talk about it a lot, but it's just kind of cool to think about.
Yeah, it's and it is a fun article to read. I thought, I mean, two things initially. You may recall when I came back and, you know, and raved on about my visit to Alula. One of the things I talked about was the guides and the setup and how you could do it. And they were predominantly women. A lot of the women who had been educated in the local university there, and they were all capable, all very good, all extremely comfortable, outgoing, engaging. You know, it was a great opportunity for them to be, you know, to be employed gainfully in an interesting job, you know, right in their hometown. They didn't have to go to Riyadh for this, you know, which turns back to Mrs. Imam in the New York Times article. I mean, she can do this job now because there's tourism. You know, all these offshoots. The other thing that comes to mind, and I think it's important that the sort of marquee names for women who are in prominent posts and this sort of thing, you know, are recognized. Like you listed a number of them, and there's so many more. We know there's so many capable women in Saudi Arabia. But you know, the next goal, I think, for people like Dana Al-Ajlani and the Women in Business Committee with the AmCham KOSA is to position more and more women systemically. You know, so when you go for a CEO or a president or a managing director or whatever, they're in that middle management, are really capable, seasoned, experienced women, you know, that have done it and can do it and can move on up. And that's when you start, you know, we'll see success. I think we'll feel a true success and a real turning of the ship, even though obviously we know it's made directional changes moving forward in a positive way. When a woman is named to a senior C-suite position and nobody mentions it, you know, it goes unnoticed because it's a regular thing. And that's always, you know, that'll be an interesting litmus test. And finally, I think we've done a lot of good things at the 966. I think it's a format. It's unique. Nobody else is doing it. I think we add real value to the conversation. It's something we're trying to do, obviously. I don't think anybody has sort of put forward more young Saudis, in particular women, than we have. You know, we've platformed people that you wouldn't know if you were a listener, you would never have heard of. And not only would you have never heard of, when you get to hear them, they're really interesting, doing, you know, fascinating, meaningful, purposeful things. So that's one thing I'm particularly proud of at the 966 is that we've platformed these kind of people.
Yeah, Richard, and I'm glad you mentioned, you said a couple of really good things there. But the first one, just wanted to note, you know, for Saudi Arabia to move to the point where a Saudi woman achieves a high position of prominence, and it's not really mentioned that she is a woman. It's just like she's the appointee, she's the person who got hired. And the fact that it's a woman is irrelevant. It's just, that's who the most qualified person is. And that's the end of the conversation. That's a goal to be reached. And I think it's achievable definitely within the next 7 years. But I feel like we will always be sort of viewing it through this lens of, because we're watching the Saudi women kind of catch up with the progress. That's what we'll see. I should note, Richard, like, you know, we're both obviously American. 10% of the Fortune 500 companies in the US are head by women. So yeah, we're far from being in a position to lecture in this regard. So
and yeah, 100%. I mean, it's always good to remember. It's always good to remember 2018. That's when women are allowed to drive.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had a cascade of other liberating legislation or decisions that gave women more power over their lives and their families. But it's very recent stuff. So when we talk about it, it's really trying to put a pin in it and say, this is where we are now. This is where it's headed. And it is fun when as you say, when, an NYT article that is not, you read the article and it's just a celebration. It's just, I came and I met this woman who was really cool. She's doing all this neat stuff. It wasn't, I don't know. It was kind of reporting as it should be. It was reporting of the situation. It didn't have a lot of context in terms of there wasn't a lot of meaning attached to the report. It was like, I went there, this was cool, she's doing neat things.
Yeah, I agree, and that is kind of just like how it jumped out to me. And Richard, I forgot to mention this in my piece here as well, but Vision 2030 included a goal of increasing female participation in the workforce to 30%. So they've blown by that, and we've talked about that before on this podcast. And then Richard, the other thing I wanted to mention is you mentioned earlier that you and I know a lot of kind of, impressive and intelligent and wonderful Saudi women through our work with the Saudi U.S. trade group over the years, delegations, major events we organized. I think if someone were to ask us in 2016, right before Vision 2030 were announced, that if these reforms were rolled out, what do you think would happen in Saudi Arabia and to its economy? I think we would have replied with what we are seeing now in real life. Female participation in the workforce would increase, efficiency would increase, quality of life for women would improve, because we know a lot of these Saudi women and how impressive and what a sleeping giant they were in the economy. And I believe that that's what Saudi authorities saw as well. I still have never had a female Saudi Uber driver, even though when you summon, and I take maybe 30 or 40 Uber rides every time I go, I still have, but the icon on the Uber app is a Saudi female driver. And it's just, all right. So that's one thing that has not happened yet, but I know they're out there. So anyway, just cool stuff. And Richard, we're actually about to have a conversation now, and we can get to it unless you have something else to
No, I think it segues nicely.
Perfectly, yeah. So let's get to our conversation now with Qanta Ahmed. She's wonderful, and I think you guys are going to enjoy this very much. Joining us now on the 966, Dr. Qanta Ahmed, physician, nonfiction author, broadcast media commentator, and writer. Dr. Qanta's got an amazing CV. She's an academic pulmonologist and sleep disorder specialist at NYU Langone in New York. She's an author and writer whose articles, columns, and opinions have been published in over 16 major market news outlets across the world. Dr. Qanta has lived in and visited Saudi Arabia now for a period spanning over 3 decades. She first visited Saudi Arabia as a single female doctor in 1999 and wrote a book called In the Land of Invisible Women. Since then, she's personally seen the changes ongoing in the kingdom in recent years since the launch of Vision 2030, and in recent months, indeed as well, visiting Saudi Arabia as the guest of the Muslim World League and at the invitation of Secretary General Dr. Mohammed Al Isa. Dr. Qanta, we're very excited to be speaking with you. Thank you for joining us on the 966. It's a pleasure.
It's an absolute privilege. So excited to be with the 966.
Oh, the privilege is ours. Thank you so much. You've been very patient. We finally get you on, and this is exciting. And let's just jump right into it. Lucien's introduction's terrific, as they always are.
Thank you.
We were laughing beforehand, Qanta, about your sort of inadvertent longitudinal study of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Going back to 1999, can you take us to the beginning, and discuss your initial encounter? What drew you to this engagement, and what were your impressions in 1999?
Richard, thank you so much for this question. Actually, I was thinking about this deeply today. Even the name of your podcast, 966, brings back so much nostalgia because, of course, I had a home phone number beginning with 966. And my home phone number was an extension of the National Guard Hospital. It was $4 a minute to call the United States from Riyadh. And today as I was preparing for our talk, one of the first memories I have is of the incredible silence. I was driven by what we call euphemistically limo drivers. Being a single woman, there was no driving permitted for women in 1999. So if I went anywhere, Zachariah, my Egyptian Christian driver, would take me. And we were sitting at a traffic light right outside of the National Guard Hospital, which at the time was situated near where the football stadium was, and there was nothing else there. There was just a football stadium and a hospital. Nobody lived out there. Riyadh had not really progressed to that area. And just sitting at the traffic light, you could hear the crackle of a radio in a neighboring car when you had the window open. And recently coming back from Saudi Arabia at the Saudi Media Forum in February, just the scale of the activity, the expansion, the development, the energy, the fact that Saudi Arabia truly is rocking so many sectors of international trade, sports, politics, energy. I just can't even begin to put into words the colossal change that I've been able to see in these 30 years. It's really, really hard for anybody who's not experienced that to understand how it's gone from a place that was really very important from an Islamic standpoint, but so unknown to most of the planet. And here we are with the podcast, the most listened to in the English language, beginning with the area code that was once dialing in to speak to me. Marvelous.
That is a trip down memory lane, and so many things are different. So when you leaves you that words, in fact, you wrote a book that has sold very well in multiple countries as a result of your experience, and sort of as a starting point, a benchmark. This book, In the Land of Invisible Women, you came out of your experience and you wrote this book. What was your take at that time on Saudi Arabia?
Well, I went there absolutely ignorant of Saudi Arabia. And because I was just on the threshold of 30 or just having turned 30, a highly trained critical care physician, felt that I knew probably most things that I needed to know. I was raised as a Muslim woman by Pakistani migrants in Britain. I knew Islam. I didn't do any preparation. Right before leaving JFK to go to Riyadh, there was a magazine rack in the airport, and I saw a picture of a Saudi gentleman, and it was a Forbes magazine profiling Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. And I thought, well, he's from Saudi Arabia. Let me read the magazine on the way over. I'll learn something about Saudi Arabia. And then I practiced medicine. And when I practiced medicine, it was high on octane, full on steroids, critical care with better equipment, more resources, more capabilities, and in many ways, more sophistication than the critical care medicine I'd left in New York City in 1999. But outside of that, nothing was comprehensible to me as a Muslim woman. And that was what was the astonishing, jarring shock. And bear in mind, I arrived on Thanksgiving Day in 1999. The world was preparing for Y2K. That was the biggest anxiety, that maybe whatever limited digitalization we had then would collapse on January 1st. So that was the environment. And when I left Saudi Arabia, it happened to be in time with avoiding another contract rolling into the next year. So I'd taken an elective resignation. I'd circled in my diary the date that I would hand in my resignation letter. I think it's very important. People should resign at least once in their life. It's an important thing to do. And I came home and turned on the television and watched NBC Today and saw September 11th. And so those two events, Y2K and September 11th, are essentially the parentheses on my time at that point. And when I came back to New York City, which was my origin in the United States, you could still smell what was happening at ground zero. Ultimately, those survivors are now my patients. Decades later, I look after people that have survived that. I realized that I'd been on a journey in medicine. I had made the Hajj. I had been in the journey inside my own relationship with Islam. And I'd been to a place that most people in the West completely misunderstood and did not know. And underneath all of that orthodoxy that all of us lived through, whether we were British American expats, whether we were European Muslims or Saudis ourselves, we were all subject to the yoke of Wahhabi neo-Orthodox fundamentalism that most Saudis themselves did not subscribe to and were very oppressed. I did not choose the name of my book. This was a choice made by the publisher. and I objected to it severely because I felt the women were not invisible. Men were just as marginalized by the ideology as women. And it was a great restriction on all humanity, that form of neo-orthodoxy that outsiders like us might refer to as Wahhabism. And from there, we now see the tremendous blossoming, including in how Islam is expressed in Saudi Arabia, not only the movement of women, but it's really been an amazing journey. And so that journey around the time of 9/11 is when I began to think about writing it. It took almost 6 or 7 years to get published.
That's fascinating. First of all, full marks and compliments for the courage and the initiative just to go.
Yep.
That's a courageous thing to do. Most people don't do it, especially single women. And obviously you're an accomplished professional in any number of other ways, involved with any significant initiatives outside of your profession. But this is sort of a foundational leap that you took. And I think that's really impressive. Second of all, I think it's really interesting that that choice of Land of Invisible Women, because both Lucien and I will attest, and I know you absolutely could speak to this. Some of the most impressive women I've ever met are in Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
And I also agree with you that as we were talking beforehand, Qanta, I had been there, first went there in the early 80s, this latent urge, both male and female, to expand their existence and that of their country. Obviously they're proud and Saudis, happy to be Saudis, but they understand what their environment is and how it can be improved and why it had gotten to the situation when you were first there. So let's jump to what prompted you to re-engage with Saudi Arabia.
So, in fact, after I left the kingdom, I continued to come back at the invitation of my academic colleagues at the National Guard, Health Affairs. They have remained, some of them tremendous colleagues, one of them very acclaimed expert in infectious disease internationally, Dr. Ziad Memmish. We have written dozens of papers together about Hajj medicine. We wrote some of the sentinel academic papers on that field. And so there were academic pursuits that kept me visiting. And I never stopped following the kingdom, but I deepened my interest after realizing there is a different kind of Islam that I'm not familiar with, realizing that there were some perpetrators that did not represent Saudis, did not represent Muslims, called themselves Muslims and perpetrated Islamist jihadism. I took almost a decade and a half pursued understanding Islamist jihadism and began visiting the region elsewhere, particularly to the state of Israel. And when I started to visit Israel, I felt there may not be a way to come back, even though I was never impugned by the kingdom, I didn't experience any retaliation. Nobody said that to me. So I sort of circumnavigated the kingdom for those years. And I still, whenever possible, wanted to set the record straight about the true Saudi kingdom, even before Vision 2030 came into being. And that was because I see this constant stereotype, which predates September 11th. I grew up as a young child when there was this whole scandal in Britain and in the Western press surrounding the concept of death of a princess. And if it's not that, it's some other issue. And if it's not that, it's Islamist jihadists. We can say Osama bin Laden, who, by the way, was stripped of his Saudi citizenship. And Saudi Arabia was the first nation to warn the United States about this movement. All those things are lost in translation. And so I was always very concerned that people understand the true Saudis. And the true Saudis I had the privilege of knowing was not just my very well-heeled colleagues who'd trained in Canada and the United States, including men and women who were Saudis, but the grandmothers and the mothers of the National Guard soldiers who were my patients. These were Bedouin women and Bedouin men. Many of them were not literate in Arabic, who welcomed me when I was looking after their family member, would bring me boxes of fresh dates from their farms. Sometimes they would shyly grab my hand and wipe incense or attar on my hand as a gift. Absolutely thrilled that I was a woman doctor, thrilled that I was a Muslim, and thrilled I was from the United States. This is a side of Saudi Arabia that people still don't see. Even Saudis today don't know it. And one thing I've learned almost 38 years after I went to medical school is being a physician is such a unique advantage and privilege. A human being in front of me puts their trust in me to help them with their health, whatever aspect it might be, physical or psychological or other. And there is an unveiling of humanity that when you meet as doctor and patient, you understand profoundly about the society in which you engage. And that's true of Saudi Arabia. That's true of the United States. And while I've been following the kingdom, I have been looking with great concern as to what is happening to my chosen place of living, New York or the United States, in comparison to Saudi Arabia. And it's this widening chasm that has me actually very worried about the United States as I see Saudi Arabia moving into sectors and into a mindset that is so profoundly American. And yet, while we're in America, we are losing that mindset, whether it's medicine, whether it's industry, whether it's family values, whether it's faith. There are so many contrasts and so much to gain by looking at ourselves through the reflection of our relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Maybe we can, and I'm not sure I'm going to properly phrase this, so help me out. One of the things we've discovered in doing this show, and I think maybe we knew it intuitively, but so when we would talk with artists or in entrepreneurs or anybody, what you discover was this talent, this drive, this passion, this hope all existed pre-Vision 2030. It was there. And this is what you're saying, I think. You know, there so much of this was there. So, but clearly, so much of this population, Saudi population, has embraced the Vision 2030. It's now their working paradigm, how they go about things, what they think is possible. Can you talk, maybe share your perspective on what are the most striking changes? And I want our listeners, and I hope you'll agree, to understand that yes, there's striking changes, but this sentiment, this drive, it's been there.
Yes. So you mentioned about meeting women from Saudi Arabia and how extraordinary they are. And of course, we come from a society where there are tremendous opportunities for women here in the United States. And so very early on, I had very few female colleagues. I was appointed there at a level essentially as a consultant in critical care medicine. I was the first woman in that healthcare system to provide critical care. I trained the first women in that country in critical care medicine, and that is high stakes medicine. But the isolated female colleagues I had, some of them were from extraordinarily privileged backgrounds. They had no need to ever earn a living. They had no need to venture into difficult, challenging medicine where everything can go wrong, but they had a great appetite for it. They were surgically skilled. They would go overseas to seek higher training at a time when travel was considered actually also a matter of family honor if a woman is traveling away from her family. And they did it surrounded by male colleagues who were, many of them were extremely supportive to me, but culturally may have been hesitant to show that support to a fellow Saudi woman. So I saw them as pioneers. One of my most esteemed colleagues, and I've not seen her for some years, but she's made a huge impact on me, Dr. Maha Al-Manif, was with me attending critically ill children, some of whom came in dire circumstances where we were concerned about their situation at home. She went on to found the first shelters for women at risk and children at risk in the kingdom. And how do you build shelters for those that might be subject to domestic abuse, domestic violence, which affects all societies? You go in person in your abaya and you speak at every courthouse to every judge And you do so well before these circumstances where there's such freedom and such integration in society. So the amount of courage, and she had actually the sponsorship of King Abdullah and one of King Abdullah's daughters. So the king himself supported these movements over 15 to 20 years ago. Very few people know that. I dedicated a chapter in my book about that. Similarly, you would have women that were some of the first obstetricians, women that were some of the first nutritionists. One of them, Dr. Dua Hamuda, created some of the first franchises in organic restaurants. As I was leaving, the kingdom was beginning to do that. So they had an entrepreneurial spirit from the start. And so they have always had this sentiment of drive, and you have to survive in that kind of environment where the climate, the irrigation, the fact that the kingdom historically was the center of so many paths of merchants from Africa all the way up to the Levant. So they have had this in them for centuries. And it's wonderful that people can see their drive, their imagination, but also their deep sense of national pride. And the reason I'm struck by that on recent visits is because we're really beginning to see an erosion in our sense of nationhood and our love for our fellow citizen in the United States. And actually, even more striking than what I've seen in Saudi Arabia is when I am in Saudi Arabia and I turn and I look westwards, and now I'm able to see the United States from a distance. That's where I see the chasm between where they are going and where we are slipping away.
We've talked about that on the 966, and I think certainly. So, for example, the Arab Barometer talks about attitudes. One of the broadest survey of public opinion, and one of the issues for the U.S. in terms of how it's perceived in the region is credibility, and a lot of that has to do with how we're behaving at home. But let's talk about, you describe Saudi Arabia as a maturing G20 nation. This is an important theme. Can you expand on that and tell us what you mean by that?
Well, I think, and perhaps it's coming from a bias where I see how Saudi Arabia is reported on news in sound bites without an understanding that Saudi Arabia is integral to not only the BRICS nations. Saudi Arabia is historically the epicenter of Islam, and the Muslim majority world looks to Saudi Arabia for leadership. Additionally, we have two of the most populous countries in the world, Pakistan and Indonesia, that are now rivaling one another for the highest number of Muslims, not counting the number of Muslims that are in India. The entire fulcrum of population and subsequent generations, the growth of Islam, the trade and economics that happens in that region of the world means that Saudi Arabia is a central kingpin in many of the decisions made, whatever the issues are being discussed. But I think two instances were most striking to me. And I was in Saudi Arabia in October last year and also February this year. Shortly after I was back in October, we had an OPEC decision made that the United States did not like, an OPEC plus decision made, which the United States commentators felt was deliberately to sabotage or undermine U.S. interests with this unfolding conflict between Russia and Ukraine to do with energy pricing. And failure to report how that is a global decision, and I know you have other commentators speaking about energy, in addition to failure to mention the Saudi Arabian government that had played a critical role in the release of hostages held by Russia, including American citizens. That was sort of vanished and not reported, made me understand that there is an expectation to engage with Saudi Arabia, not on an equal plane. Now, the United States is a tremendous superpower. Saudi Arabia is a huge petrochemical power. There's not an equivalence. But Saudi Arabia is no longer a nation that will provide energy on its bidding of the 20th century. It is a very important influencer that is rightly maintaining its neutrality in, for instance, this extremely troubling conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And so for Saudi Arabia to be able to use its relationships that it's built through almost 80 years of engaging in energy with, for instance, Russia, is only to the benefit of the West. And yet it is portrayed and villainized and demonized for maintaining neutrality. And I think I see this again and again. There's no understanding of its role in the G20. There's no understanding Saudi Arabia is becoming extremely sophisticated in areas of diplomacy outside of energy. There's a traditional thinking of oil for security as the only engagement with the West. That is not correct. And I also think there's been tremendous bias, which has been perpetuated for various interests to portray negatively the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, which serves certain narratives, which means that the West does not look at Saudi Arabia intelligently or truly deeply or critically. It's much easier to caricature a country that you don't want to understand deeply, maybe because you fear that the country is changing, is maturing, is becoming more sophisticated. And it's much easier to think about it without nuance, in tandem with old tropes. Now, I'm aware that you are a co-founder of the Saudi-US Trade Group, and you have very sophisticated understandings, and this is not denigrating my adoptive nation. I'm a very proud naturalized American, but we could do a lot better. And I think we have a great deal to learn from how Saudi Arabia manages these issues. Another example I'll give you, in September 2020, I was privileged to be on the South Lawn in the White House during the signing of the Abraham Accords. And that was historic and momentous, and I think was a tremendous contribution to the nations in the region and the United States. I think it's very important, and I'm a strong advocate for the Abraham Accords. And there's been a constant drumbeat as to when Saudi Arabia will become a party and a participant, and how Saudi Arabia could be drawn into this, as if the kingdom could or operates on inducements or in a transactional capacity, and not as an entity creating and engaging in a vision and direction of its own making. I do, in fact, believe Saudi Arabia, and I have no access to any diplomats, so I'm just speculating. I absolutely do believe Saudi Arabia will eventually become a treaty to this agreement. I do believe Saudi Arabia will work with the surrounding region to stabilize the intensely, deeply fissured conflict between Israel and Palestine. I think that's to everybody's advantage, but Saudi Arabia will do it on its own terms. Saudi Arabia will probably lead those negotiations with the Arab world. And this is where I think the United States has become somewhat fossilized and somewhat stuck in a 20th century mindset, when the 21st century shows us how this region and the kingdom in particular is rewriting the script.
I think that's well said. And I think it speaks to a regular theme here on the 966. And there's so much to unwrap there. Certainly, we have advocated for a very long time that the U.S. updates, first, its administrators and opinion leaders and people who are making decisions within the administration, update, revamp its understanding of Saudi Arabia and the relationship. I will say, that October event, the OPEC decision, coming on the heels of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022, and was received as I think it was what do we called it? Brouhaha, but it was a firestorm. That's what we've called it. Yes, because it was during an election in November, and I would say, and I want to move on actually to another question, but I would
Mm-hmm.
say that the communication, the understanding, the relationship has actually progressed positively since then, in part because of that. And that we're actually in a better position now, not where we want to be, but it also doesn't speak to what you're saying, that America prefers its tropes, and there is very little nuance, which I think is something we're trying to get to here. But there's a very important thing that you got there, and this is how Saudi Arabia, in a variety of ways, influences the world. And in particular, you mentioned Pakistan and Indonesia, and also India as significant Muslim populations who pay close attention to Saudi Arabia. One of the things that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been, as a key pillar of Vision 2030, is a rediscovery and a promotion of a moderate Islam. And he would say, as many people around him would say, this is not a moderate Islam. This is original Islam, which is inherently moderate. So, it had been co-opted, hijacked. We are trying to recover this and be, in their minds, proper Muslims. A major important vehicle of this is the Muslim World League. And
Absolutely.
This is Dr. Muhammad Alisa, who currently is in India at this moment. And he has been extremely active in taking this message forward, embodying this message. He visited Holocaust museums, and he's been sort of the figurehead for moderation. Can you talk a little bit about the Muslim World League and Dr. Muhammad?
My pleasure. In fact, it was extraordinarily stunning to me that one of his advisors, Dr. Haya Al-Jadua, contacted me after I was speaking about the Saudi Arabia on Newsmax. And I spoke about it's absolutely unfair to demonize the kingdom in some other context. President Biden had been visiting Saudi Arabia at the time. And she asked me to come to the kingdom and meet Dr. Muhammad Alisa. And I said, well, that's very nice. I'm not sure who he is. And by the way, I've spent almost a dozen trips to Israel, and maybe you're not going to be able to have me. And I've lost most of my Saudi friends because they've called me a Zionist. And she starts laughing. And I'm thinking, well, obviously she doesn't know what a Zionist is when it's said in a not respectful way. And she said, no, you don't understand. She said, Dr. Alisa has been to Auschwitz. He is led the most senior delegation of Muslims to pray in Auschwitz. He's named the Holocaust is a crime against humanity. He just gave the sermon at Mecca, and I had read about his sermon in the New York Times. So a few months later, I was there at his Riyadh offices in a private meeting with him that was off the record, but I've been able to write about it and disclose a lot of what we discussed. I just was astounded, not only by his intellect. We had a translator. I'm not fluent in Arabic. I can read Arabic, but I can't converse in Arabic. His translator actually speaks fluent Urdu. And so we spoke in English. I spoke in English. He spoke in Arabic. And our short meeting turned into almost 4 hours, where we discussed Islamism. One of the first things Dr. Alisa talked to me about was his fears about the Russia-Ukraine war. And could we imagine that we have two Christian nations at war with one another, using the language of holy war? Because, of course, Putin had been speaking about his very fire-breathing Orthodox Christian leader. I forget the name of his Christian priest that's very pro the conflict, and Zelensky had been speaking about Ukrainian soldiers being lost as martyrs. And so this language, in the context of Saudi Arabia's experience with the sharp end of Islamist jihadism in a terrible way, just immediately revealed to me what a deep thinker Dr. Alisa is. His experience of Islam and his values that he is able to expose to the world are exactly the Islam in which I was raised, which then came to such brutal collisions with the state-enforced orthodoxy that I had encountered 23 years ago. And there's so many things that Dr. Al-Issa is doing. The most important that he's done recently is author a document called the Charter of Mecca, which was made public in 2019. And it extols, I think, about 15 tenets, which include there can be no compulsion in faith. Every creed has its place. There is more than one route to our Maker. There can be no prejudice or racism in the name of religion. The importance of environmental stewardship, the importance of preserving human dignity. And these are not just sayings, these are now becoming implementations in various programs. And I was just at one of the first meetings in London with European Muslim leaders. But even more than his work in that capacity, we recently met with him here at the United Nations when he was bringing an interfaith dialogue into the United Nations in New York City. It is also the fact that Dr. Al-Issa is so deeply supported by the Saudi monarchy, by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and how skillfully and expertly the yoke or the mantle of neo-Orthodox fundamentalism has been lifted from Saudi Arabia, and therefore from legitimacy through the Muslim world to allow true Islam to engage without violence, without upheaval, without revolution. And that has been done by introducing new thinkers with true pluralist values in Islam, engaging in dialogue, whereby at one of the Muslim world meetings in London, I was able to meet a leading Shia cleric who has been recognized by the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia and who is calling for engagement between Sunnis and Shias inside the kingdom, where Shias can now provide the literature on their religious values in the kingdom in a way to not marginalize and isolate different believers into silos where hostilities can breed. And this is absolutely lost on Western commentators. And this can only happen because these are the values of King Salman, and these are the values of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who one day will become king. This could never happen only with the intellect of Dr. Muhammad Al-Issa. Dr. Muhammad Al-Issa is not just Secretary General of the Muslim World League, which, as you know, is international. It is not a Saudi organization. It was founded in Mecca, but it is an international organization with a Supreme Council of about 60 members from different Muslim majority countries. That is the giant hub that rotates the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world. And that's why the influence of Dr. Al-Issa represents the sentiment and philosophy of the apex of the Saudi kingdom. And that is why it's so extraordinary.
Dr. Qanta, you have visited Saudi Arabia in several capacities, professional capacity, as a tourist and as someone who has performed the Hajj. You're also an academic expert on Hajj medicine. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Well, you know, we wrote some of the earliest papers in English, not the first, because part of our papers, I went to the British Library and dug up from the 19th century archives from British medical literature of what was said about the Muslim pilgrimage when Muslims, we were referred to as Mohammedans in academic papers. But we did realize that there is a remarkable challenge in managing humanity in the pilgrimage. And in fact, this may actually tie into all of the themes we've just been talking about, where we have to perform these rituals. When I performed the Hajj, by the grace of God, it was the year 2000. And that year, if I remember correctly, about 2.2 million people or 2.5 million people were engaging in the Hajj. Remember, really very few cell phones. I didn't have a cell phone. There was not Wi-Fi everywhere. There were so many aspects in technology that we didn't have. And yet 2.5 million people can complete this ritual, which is in a number of days in very confined circumstances. And that happens because of the Islamic principle: when you're in Hajj, you can bear no ill to anybody. You cannot lose your temper. You cannot bring a weapon anywhere close to that area. The only way humanity can engage and complete Hajj is through cooperation. And that is the metaphor of Hajj. We say in Islam, when you are conducting Hajj, you are presenting yourself to meet your maker in this lifetime. That is what we believe. And you go to Hajj only by invitation. And my invitation came in a very strange way right after we had saved the life of a critically ill young girl who was 14. And a colleague said to me, look, why don't you go to Hajj? Because you never know when you'll be here again. And that was my invitation. I had no previous intention to do that. And that metaphor of putting your own needs behind those of maybe the elderly person next to you, maybe the disabled person, maybe the baby, maybe whoever may be conducting that alongside you in crowds of millions, tolerating temperature, tolerating proximity, tolerating thirst. That metaphor for cooperation is something that greatly determines the philosophy of the kingdom. We can talk about the health risks. I mean, Saudi Arabia's developed a unique expertise in managing epidemics, pandemics, mass gatherings, heat exposure, dehydration, respiratory infections, whether masks were useful. I mean, all of that. And the experts in Hajj, there's a Ministry of Hajj, the experts in Hajj health now inform the Olympics, and they inform the World Cup, and they inform American inaugurations. Much more important than that is the Hajj happens every year, and there is a 9-month lead time to prepare for a 3-month Hajj season. And that event is bigger than the Olympics happening annually, involving Muslims from 193 countries and their governments. So if you have Ebola in Uganda, you have to now plan for what's going to happen to the Ugandan Muslims. If you have a conflict with a neighboring nation, let's say Ukraine or sometimes Iran, how are you going to manage these pilgrims? Saudi Arabia has been engaging in global diplomacy with the Hajj at its epicenter for its entire existence. And that gives it remarkable skill and remarkable humility. Because, for instance, most moving to me was how Saudi Arabia managed the pandemic. Do you know Saudi Arabia was one of the very first nations to close its borders in February 2020, I think February 25th, 2020. Saudi Arabia immobilized its own population from going to pilgrimage, which is a very heartbreaking decision for the kingdom to make, because the kingdom knows it is the guardian, the custodian of the two holiest cities. And eventually Saudi Arabia had a very, very pared down pilgrimage, including in 2020. If you look at the pictures, and I published an article about this in The Spectator in London, the images are truly balletic, like ballet, in a completely massive religious complex. People were distanced, people were protected, and just a handful of people were able to complete that. And little by little, they expanded it out to the world. That indicates to you the gravity and seriousness with which Saudi Arabia takes its role as the protector for the holiest sites for billions of humanity. And that's a responsibility that no other country in the world faces. And then when Richard spoke about Pakistan, we're extremely worried. I'm from a Pakistani family, about the stability and future of Pakistan. And next to Pakistan, Afghanistan, whose name is almost never mentioned. We know that we've had 2 decades of military and political solutions presented to Afghanistan that ended in abject failure with the Taliban now at the helm. How are we going to reach these communities other than through a language and dialogue of dismantling fundamentalism and enabling the blossoming of pluralist Islam? There is no Western diplomat that has that capability. And I'm not suggesting that that's Saudi Arabia's intention or its plan or an undertaking, but the method or the blueprint to remove neo-fundamentalism, that oppresses men and women, that blueprint has been very clearly demonstrated in Saudi Arabia. It is not the way we're seeing the protests in Iran, and hence my recent essay. It is absolutely through skillful empowering of pluralist voices, which the kingdom has been doing steadily for years. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is greatly to be credited for catalyzing that and propagating that and taking the heat for that, because this is why the country is coming along.
They're also using AI now to manage the Hajj, which is interesting. You were recently in Saudi Arabia in February at the Saudi Media Forum. You talked about Saudi Arabia, the importance of Saudi Arabia investing in AI and AI systems because they're based on learned information. And you discussed the future of AI, and you said, and this is from Arab News, unless Saudi Arabia embraces AI from the outset, we are going to see an expanded bias that we are already seeing in the English language written media, which often promotes ancient stereotypes. Can you talk a little bit about that as well? I think that's super interesting. And we know Saudi Arabia is interested in AI. They're using it for the Hajj, but can you expand on that just a little bit? That's fascinating.
So, it's funny because we were talking about AI this morning in medicine, and it is, I think it's extremely fascinating. It is extremely important that we get to engage with AI and put in the correct level of investment and education so that we are not locked out of this next technological shift. It would be, for instance, watching the computer revolution without having access to a PC or a Mac. So we cannot have a country like Saudi Arabia be locked out. And especially when Saudi Arabia is at the apex of the Muslim world, where so much of the Muslim majority world is still not literate in its basic language, let alone literate in its religion. The reason I said that in the column and also at the media forum is because of exactly what we've just been talking about. And in fact, you at 966 are building precisely the kind of nuance and insight that is available almost nowhere else, unless you're in a little dinner party with people that have seasoned experience with Saudi Arabia. And I may not be really so seasoned. And what I'm worried about is if we're using AI English language platforms in Saudi Arabia, but almost all of the English language commentary about Saudi Arabia has not been written by Saudis, has not even been written by Westerners that travel to Saudi. All those media commentators, when they refer to the October OPEC decision-making as the firestorm that Richard mentioned, I'd expect that almost none of them had ever traveled, let alone lived in the kingdom or been amongst a Saudi family or really understood that industry from a level of intimacy to give them true perspective. Saudi Arabia needs to command not only its own sectors in trade and tourism and religious tourism and recreational tourism. They need to increase their English language footprint, whether it is a media outlet that may rival and one day supersede Al Jazeera, whether it is many more newspapers of the stature of the Arab News, which is a remarkably valuable platform, which we used to read in the 1990s. It came in a green paper version. There was no digital version.
It
and
was
that made
known as the Green Truth.
The Green Truth, yes. And so, but that will require English language facility in Saudi journalism, English language facility in Saudi cable. It needs Saudis who can write their own story in our language, not only their language. And I think they're just beginning to envision their story. I want to say one thing before we end, and I sense that we may be getting close to the end. And when I talk about being in Riyadh and looking eastwards and thinking about New York City, what I'm actually looking at is our younger generation. And the overwhelming feeling I got on returning to Saudi Arabia, apart from meeting the extraordinary colleagues at the Muslim World League, Dr. Muhammad Al Isa, is the vibrance and the energy and the enthusiasm of the younger generation. When I first lived in Saudi Arabia, I couldn't believe I'd never seen so many Cadillacs and Mercedes-Benz and GMCs in one place ever. And I had also never seen so much black worn other than in New York. So I remember that vividly. But now what I noticed when I was sitting, being driven around in a beautiful, automobile somebody provided me, is the number of Mazdas and the number of Suzukis and the number of Mini Coopers, the surge of a middle class in Saudi Arabia, which was so amazing. People were in their modest cars. There was a rush hour. They were busy going somewhere because they had to go to work, or they were going shopping, or they were going to an entertainment venue, or they were going on a vacation. That mobility and that energy and that entire class of people did not exist when I lived there. We had the professionals, the diplomats, the soldiers, the doctors, the dentists. We had the National Guard. We had very few academics, and we had people that were impoverished, the Bedouins and the rural farm workers. But now there is a huge army of middle class, and that is the focus of the kingdom. And that intense focus, how are we going to educate them? How are we going to feed them? How are we going to meet their sustainable energy needs? How are we going to keep them from becoming indoctrinated by some new fundamentalism or some new radicalization? And when I come back to the United States, I treat patients that are of that age, or we have friends and family with people of that age. And I see the lack of direction and the lack of aspiration and the lack of hope and the lack of national focus on our youth. And that's the huge contrast.
We are unfortunately running short on time, Dr. Qanta. This has been absolutely marvelous. One last question, I promise, a short one. What's next for you? What's on the horizon for you?
Well, what a great question. In fact, in terms of this, I'm very interested in learning and speaking more about international religious freedom. I've been very concerned about the effects of Islamism, political Islam, and how it has limited the rights and freedoms of people who are Christian, people who are Yazidi, and people who are pluralist Muslims. That's why I'm so invigorated to see the Saudi Kingdom and the Muslim World League take such a strong position against extremism, and particularly Islamist ideology. And so I'm hoping to be able to go back to Iraq, where I visited on 3 occasions, to post-ISIS regions in northern Iraq, and see how our efforts there are unfolding with the Yazidi community. This is a community that I would like Saudi Arabia to take an interest in, is these people that have been left behind after conflict, and they're still in refugee camps 7 years later. There have been elections won on defeating ISIS here in the United States, but our Yazidi refugees do not have water, they do not have air conditioning, they do not have schools. Similarly, the veterans that fought those wars, the Peshmerga, their children don't have a future. So this part very much concerns me. And the other part is, you mentioned AI. I'm very interested in how AI is going to influence American medicine, particularly my discipline of sleep medicine. I'm very heavily engaged in advancing neurostimulation in sleep medicine. And in fact, speaking to colleagues about hopefully coming and speaking at a sleep medicine conference in Saudi Arabia. So maybe there will be finally a way that I can join my academic sleep practice and my amateur foreign policy interests into Riyadh. I think that would be great.
Inshallah, that'd be amazing. Dr. Qanta Ahmed, physician, nonfiction author, broadcast media commentator, writer, one of our favorite guests on the 966. Now we can add that to your CV. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been marvelous.
Absolute pleasure.
Richard, that was our conversation with Dr. Qanta Ahmed, who was great. We thank her for her time, and we just really enjoyed that conversation.
Well,
And
kudos for you for the hookup. It was great to get her perspective because it's an unusual and meaningful perspective.
she was terrific, and we really enjoyed that. So, yeah, good stuff. Richard, let's get to Yallah.
Saudi in a
Yallah.
minute.
Yallah. Everybody knows now that when we say let's get to Yallah, to remove your headphones
By
or
the
whatever
way,
you're listening to this.
I think it's clear that we don't practice that. This is just to like how you're feeling at that particular moment. Like sometimes I get more energy to really go in and be stupid, which I don't need a lot of pretext to be stupid. My kids will attest to that.
Yep.
Yeah, and other times it's a little more laid back and stuff. So yeah, this is completely spontaneous. This is reality podcasting.
This is reality audio. And Richard, we should note too that we have done that for all 94 episodes, and it makes us laugh every time. And I think we're just going to continue. It would feel weird to not do it, to be honest. So,
well, we don't want to break this.
No, yeah,
yeah. So, and it completely unprompted. I have no idea how it started or why it started. Yellow number one. Senior Biden advisor Amos Hochstein met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem on Tuesday to discuss U.S. efforts to get a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the recent tensions on the Israeli-Lebanese border, two Israeli officials told Axios. The White House is pushing to reach a set of agreements that would upgrade U.S.-Saudi relations and normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Richard, how about the tear that President Biden is on in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah.
He just left the NATO summit. There's a lot of stuff going on with that. He spoke last week with Fareed Zakaria on CNN. That was a great interview. He said there was a long way to go here on the Saudi-Israeli deal, but I think this would be an enormous diplomatic and foreign policy achievement. I think not just enormous, but historic, obviously. The article also says that Biden is pushing forward on other fronts to make this happen. I'm sure these are just the ones we know about in public, but pressing the Lebanese government and military to take steps to dismantle a Hezbollah outpost, I should say, that was established right on the Israeli-Lebanon border. And then the other thing from that interview that I wanted to just sort of mention in this context, Richard, was when President Biden was sort of asked about some carrots for Saudi Arabia to warm up to Israel. He said, quote, "Quite frankly, I don't think they have much of a problem with Israel." It was kind of you don't really get a lot of candor like that on issues, foreign policy issues, especially. So interesting story here.
Yeah. Fighting Joe Biden just left the NATO confab and laid into Russia. I think the world, certainly the perceptions of the U.S. in terms of foreign policy globally have significantly improved under Joe Biden because it seems to be a coherent, responsible, well-communicated policy or policies. I think he's sneakily been a good president, and that's just my opinion.
I agree.
And particularly a calming element at a very difficult time domestically and a very, unsettled time globally. So it's an interesting time. Now, I will say this on this Yallah, this is very unusual because we do our Yallahs and we have, we go, all right, what about this? What about this? And I will do these 6. And then we each, research them.
Mm-hmm.
I have 0 notes after this one.
Why is that? Just because it's so complicated and involving as an issue, or just?
I just think it's premature. It's unlikely. It's fascinating for a lot of reasons. It's hard to get into. So you're right. President Biden said this is not likely to happen soon. The Saudis, if you probably ask them, are getting what they want from Israel. I mean, I think ultimately they can see, and Princess Rima spoke about this, they can see an Israel integrated in the region and with all the economic and commercial benefits of that. I don't think they're averse to that at all. They're in no hurry to make, to normalize relations with Netanyahu-led Israel. And I think they're in no hurry in general. They also realize that what they want, which is a more certain security relationship with the U.S., as well as sort of a green light and participation to develop their nuclear program, including enrichment, which is what they want, Um, it, neither of those possibly, certainly the security agreement is going to be ratified in the U.S. Congress. So while they like to have the discussion, they've realized they can't rely on a president's commitment because it changes from president to president, and sometimes it changes within a president's administration. So their concern is not that the U.S. is capable of protecting their interests in the region and their security in the region. It's their concern is that there's a willingness to do so. And yes, they'd like to get it ratified and make it a legal treaty. But even Israel doesn't have one of these, and I don't think they expect to get one. I think what they have to love is the whole tenor and nature and direction of the conversation since Joe Biden was elected. And we know that was a very difficult, rocky relationship. Joe Biden had made some comments, campaign era comments that were unappreciated. Saudi Arabia was already, a little certainly uncertain about where the U.S. was headed. So I think there's clearly a lot of communication. There seems to be an aligning of interests. There seems to be a recognition that the relationship has changed and evolved, and it seems to be a more adult conversation at the moment, if that's a term. But the Saudis are in no hurry. They're getting what they want from Israel. They certainly are not going to do anything lightly with regard to normalization that doesn't include, application of the Arab Peace Initiative in the occupied territories, because they have a responsibility to the Islamic world and the Arab world, and that is like no one else, and they take it seriously. So all these conversations, we've talked about it, are typically pushed by the Israeli side, thinking they can, move this along and it'd be good, it'd be a good win. But, the carrot out there for the Saudis is you normalize with Israel and you get, tremendous goodwill from the U.S. Is not sufficient.
Yep.
It's got to be more. It's got to be harder. It's got to be more, more tangible. And they're just not giving this way for good PR. It would have to be something very significant that furthers Saudi Arabia's domestic, regional, and global interests. So I guess obviously I have a lot of thoughts on the topic, but I don't run any notes on it because it can go in any direction. I don't think it's going anywhere right now.
Yeah, are you sure you don't have notes, Richard? Because that was a really good response. No, I completely agree. It was very thoughtful, and I think you're spot on. And as you were saying that, I was sort of thinking, well, no one really saw the Iran deal coming, the Saudi-Iran deal, but there were a lot of carrots for Saudi Arabia to start going down that path. It actually did make a lot of sense. It just seemed impossible. This seems impossible, and for Saudi Arabia, it does not seem to make a lot of sense right now if they're not going to get much out of it. So I think those are great points, Richard.
Yeah, and I mean, the big opportunity is on a nuclear, and Saudi Arabia would like us involved, like us to sign off, but they're not going to give up the enrichment capability. I mean, their point is, look, the cat's already out of the bag. Israel has nuclear weapons and enriches. In the agreement with Iran, there was a sunset clause that would have allowed them to move along that path too. So they don't. The UAE did a gold standard where there's no enrichment at all. But they just want to have the discussion because they think two things. One, they think nuclear capability would be significant to their efforts to decarbonize their economy and move to fossil fuel energy. And they also feel like they have significant uranium deposits, and that they can be they should be allowed to move along this enrichment path and become a player in that field. And also, as they've stated quite loudly and just clearly, if Iran enriches and gets the bomb, they feel they have the right to do it themselves. So that's a sticky one. It's all a sticky one. They're all sticky.
Yep.
They're all difficult.
Otherwise, they'd just do it, or they'd be like, okay, yeah.
But the nice thing is these are all ongoing conversations. I
Yep.
mean, 18 months ago, there was Zippo going on. It was a lot of contention, a lot of very antagonistic relationship. And by that, I mean, there's, the institutional relationships are in place and those conversations are going, but I'm talking at the very top. And so this is, just on the basis of what's being discussed and things are being discussed, it's a positive thing. The likelihood of it in the near term, not high.
Right. And there's also a lot of things that make you say, like, Ambassador
Yes.
Ratney formerly was a high-ranking State Department official in Israel. I mean, there's like a lot of stuff like that where you can kind of see it, to kind of just to highlight your point. It just you see it sort of in a good spot now, but as far as July 13th being the day, maybe not, but I mean, so
We should know this. Didn't we just name an envoy to promote Abraham Accords? I
we
thought we
should know
did.
this.
We should,
We
and
should.
good on it. The Abraham Accords are a positive thing.
Yeah.
It's just Saudi Arabia is a whole different animal.
Yeah, definitely. Richard, Yallah number 2. Saudi Arabia recently participated in the virtual ministerial meeting announcing the launch of the Global Coalition to Address Synthetic Drug Threats. According to the White House website, the coalition aims to, quote, expedite actions against illegal synthetic drugs, unquote. It will, quote, employ coordinated strategies to prevent illicit drug production, identify emerging drug threats, disrupt trafficking, combat illicit financial activities, and address the impacts on public safety and public health, end quote. Following establishment of the global coalition, the United States will initiate consultations with participating countries to establish priority actions and measures to confront synthetic drugs. Partners will collaborate in working groups to offer new solutions, drive national action, and advance combating synthetic drugs as a policy priority.
That was a long one. Sorry.
No, it's all good. What's a synthetic drug? Like
Fentanyl.
okay. Oh,
All
so
the
like okay, yeah, okay.
Captagon.
Okay.
I
Cool.
guess things like cotton, weed, and that sort of thing are organic.
Okay.
Okay. A couple things. Anyway, this just prompted a very odd thought. The reason, I suggested this, and you said, we were all good with this. I just like it when there's global coalitions and Saudi Arabia is part of it, but also is it a bit of, it's a savvy move. Saudi Arabia is dealing with a significant, issue with Captagon and amphetamines. This is something that I did not know. Did you know in the U.S. synthetic drugs are the number one killer of Americans aged 18 to 49? Nearly 110,000 Americans died last year of a drug overdose.
Wow.
2/3 of those deaths involve synthetic opioids. So, and causing nearly 1.5 trillion in an economic toll in terms of health and judicial system and that sort of thing.
Wow.
It's stunning. So, it's interesting. There's a global coalition here, and it's also, when you share your sorrows, get together and try and work on things that are, plaguing all of us. It's another, avenue to get closer and be on the same page. Always a positive.
Yeah.
Trying to combat a big negative.
Yeah. And the fact that the US and Saudi Arabia are going to coordinate a little bit on this is good because the US has been fighting the drug trade for 6 decades in a pretty sophisticated way. So to have their assistance for Saudi Arabia is helpful because, I mean, I think now, like in Saudi Arabia, I guess my question about synthetic drugs, I was like, aren't all drugs, except for like one or two, just, basically synthesized or created somehow? But I mean, this is like things like meth and, Captagon. Both of those drugs, Richard, as you know, are starting to take off in Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, as for recreational use. And it's a serious problem. Both of those drugs are very dangerous. Like you just mentioned, they are already here in the United States and already killing 100,000 people a year. But I mean, Saudi Arabia does not want to have it reach that level. So there, you can really see in the media the reports of stepping up arrests and kind of publicizing the punishment that you will receive for doing this type of trade.
Yeah. And as listeners to the 966 know, I mean, we did a segment on Captagon, and Syria is essentially a narco state, and dealing with that, that was a major motivation, one element of trying to bring them in from the cold to the Arab League. You got to deal with this. And you're right, tapping into the networks and the intelligence systems and understanding financial activities that the U.S. has gained over the years is a bonus for the Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
Yallah number 3, PGA Tour says Saudi wealth fund could put at least $1 billion into golf deal. A PGA Tour executive told Congress on Tuesday that Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund could invest more than $1 billion in an ambitious alliance that stands to reshape professional golf. If it withstands scrutiny in Washington and a wellspring of suspicion and outrage over the Saudis' widening role in a global sport. Appearing before senators, the tour's chief operating officer, Ron Price, said that the size of a cash infusion from the wealth fund into a planned for-profit company was not final, but he acknowledged that discussions, quote unquote, that could ultimately result in investment north of $1 billion, according to the New York Times.
Richard, 2 things on this. First, $1 billion, like maybe I'm jaded. Like you talk about the PIF, you talk about sports investing. $1 billion does not seem like that much money. The Washington Commanders are about to sell for $6 billion. It's a comparison we made 2 weeks ago. We spoke with Simon Chadwick. Just phenomenal discussion. All of our conversations with all of our guests are great, but this one was especially excellent because he is quoted almost daily in a major market newspaper on this subject. So to have him join us right in the middle of all of that was an honor and was really cool. But I mean, this just doesn't seem like that much money that everyone should be sort of freaking out over, because this is not that much money in the world of sports globally. So that's just one thought. I mean, I know that golf is not as big as the NFL, but it just seems like not that much money. And then the second thing that I thought was interesting here, Richard, is, like Capitol Hill never misses a chance to grandstand and to take an issue and say, look, we're going to draw attention to it. That's their job. That's their role, is to say, well, we're going to look at it. We're going to grill these guys. That was a contentious conversation they had on the Hill. I don't know if you saw much of it, but it was kind of a little uncomfortable to watch. Just very, very kind of contentious, but a lot of this is classic Capitol Hill. It's not sort of making a big deal out of this so that it forwards the conversation. But just sort of thought, like, is this, after this deal is done, are people going to boycott the PGA? And like, is that what, would they be worried about that? I don't think so. I mean, there's now only one game in town, so there could be other results that negatively affect the PIF or the PGA. They may get taxed, or there may be more hearings, but like, are people going to be like, well, the Saudis have invested in PGA, I'm not going to watch golf anymore? It doesn't seem like that would be the case to me, but maybe.
Yeah, this is another thing we've done, covered a lot, and we've done a number of segments on, and I think I did a rant on how silly it is when people say that, that Liv bought the PGA. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And you see this in the comments of PGA executives going up before Congress saying, look, this is a framework agreement. We have complete control. And, and it is, by the way, they talk about a framework agreement, so it may still not get done. But, explicit throughout is, heck no, we have complete control, PGA. The Saudis have bought into an investment in marketing opportunities. And, the perhaps a bigger concern is the Department of Justice looking into a monopoly and anti collusion, charges. There's a lot of memos out there, and when Liv is saying, okay, we won't recruit and we won't do this and that, people will want to say collusion. It will be interesting if it goes through. I would like to see it go through. I think everyone would like to see it go through and a resolution of the matter. I mean, nobody wants this sort of neither nor situation with Liv and PGA and DP Golf to continue. I think all the executives that got together, Yasser Rumian and Monahan and all those people, there was a compelling reason to get this agreement. Obviously, it had some PR issues, and they have difficulties within their own PGA because they couldn't communicate it. And of course, there's the everybody, significant percentage of the U.S. have a bad image of Saudi Arabia. So it's all wrapped up in a lot of things. You're right. I'm always a little, when Congress gets on its bandstand. So anyway, they went through it. They did it. We'll see what happens. My point all along is a good deal for PGA. And if you're concerned about the PGA, let it go through. If you're concerned about collusion and monopoly, maybe you can pursue that avenue. But certainly, golf as we know it is not done. It's probably significantly enhanced.
Richard, we do a lot of talk about the PGA and golf on this program. We don't do enough playing of golf.
This is true.
We should move towards the playing more.
I'm with you 100%.
Richard, Yallah, number 4. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Environment, Water, and Agriculture has been installing 1,350 kilometers of water pipes across the capital city as part of the Green Riyadh program, the official Saudi press agency reported. This comes as part of its efforts to carry 1.7 million cubic meters of treated water daily to irrigate 7.5 million trees in the city. The aim is to achieve sustainable green spaces for the Green Riyadh projects and other development projects in the city, the report said. The diameter of the primary pipes range from 1.2 to 2.4 meters. Secondary networks reach all Riyadh neighborhoods. This is cool.
It is cool. And there's not much to add here. I just think it's important to acknowledge and recognize these touchstones along the way towards achieving a goal. Mm-hmm. You can't plant 7.5 million trees, or ultimately many more than that, and somehow not water them. In order to do that, you have to put in, and they're going to put in more, put in 13,000 kilometers of water pipes. I mean, this is a huge project just to sustain this. And the goal is to increase green coverage of Riyadh to 9.1%, which I guess just in the article. So this is a per capita share of green spaces from 1.7 square meters to 28 square meters, 16 times its current level. So they're really trying to make a difference here. But again, you can't do that. And it's also a good use, it's good use of treated water.
Yeah.
So these are all positive things. And it's one of those steps that are not sexy, putting a bunch of pipes in the ground. I mean, I didn't see the headline for that. But it's critical if you want a greener and, greener Riyadh or greener anything and have a better living environment and improve quality of life. So it's a good one. And
you can see it, Richard, in Riyadh. You were just there. You could see the trees going up. I mean, 7.5 million trees. You kind of can't miss that.
I mean, yeah,
it's cool. I mean, you can really see them going neighborhood by neighborhood and on major thoroughfares as well, putting these trees up. And so you're right. I just kind of giggle because you're like, you can't have these trees but have no water to give them. And so it does make sense. It's cool. I mean, that's so. Yeah, good story. And also file this under another thing that sounded a little bit ambitious at first. The number of trees they wanted to plant and that they wanted to turn Riyadh into a green space and King Salman Park and all this stuff. And then, 8 months later, you have, hey, we're putting in all these pipes going all over every neighborhood to water these trees. You're like, oh, yeah, that's right. You guys are doing it. So, good on them.
Yallah, number 5, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund reported a loss in investment activities of about $11 billion last year compared to a profit of $19 billion in 2021 as global markets sank. Total assets of the PIF, as the fund is known, rose to about $778 billion from $675 billion.
Yeah, Richard, this so it's likely that we will see a bounce back again in 2023. We're already halfway through the year. A theme we've mentioned several times actually on the show, but I mean, so that this is for 2022. So 6 months in, and we've kind of seen global markets trend back up. So we can kind of expect that to happen for the PIF this year, maybe. This is also not really attached to the investments that it has been making in sports that are generating all of the headlines. This is essentially just markets, and all of the positions they've taken in markets have gone down in 2022. So I think we'll probably see that bounce back in 2023. Um, yeah, I mean, stocks go up and stocks go down, so it's interesting. That's a lot of money.
We had one of the nice things. We love feedback, and we had this was one of our featured thing on Tuesday on Tuesday this week, and our good friend Amar Khashoggi, who's been on the show, and we'll have him on again, it was awesome, sent me a note. So he's checking the Sustig review every day, like thousands of others, and he said, oh, by the way, everybody got bombed last year in terms of sovereign wealth funds. And he pointed out, he said, the Singapore fund was down, Temasek was down, significant amount. But the one that really got Norway's $1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund lost 164 billion in 2022. Wow. I mean, the market in general was really impacted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation, rising interest rates. It was, all sectors of the equity market, bonds and stocks, were all showing negative returns. There was nowhere to go. I mean, except of energy, but it just crushed global, sovereign wealth funds everywhere. What I did think was interesting about this, and it was something I'm sure you've seen close up, is it seemed to spark a move into, you getting a larger percentage of sovereign wealth funds and institutional funds that are allocating funds to hedge funds and private credit and that sort of thing, just to try and mix it up, because the year was so bad with nowhere to go in stocks or bonds. They're trying to find other ways to move it along and try and get some return. So yeah, 2022 was bad for everybody, including the PIF.
Yep. And we also got an update, Richard, on the figures. So they now have 778 billion, as you noted. That keeps going up. So that's a lot of money.
Yeah, and they get inflows from Aramco and that sort of thing. So it's making progress. I guess the fund currently owns 79 companies. With total assets to about 778 billion, as you mentioned. So, and it's up to its portfolio in the US is 35.6 billion. So, but as we know, all these things change. But yeah, 2022 rocked sovereign wealth funds and other investment vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Richard, Yallah number 6. Saudi Arabia's Neom green hydrogen project is formally under construction and is expected to be completed by 2026, the end of 2026. Aqua Power said in a statement to the Saudi Stock Exchange, the Tadawul, on Thursday, the company's affiliate Neom Green Hydrogen Company, NGHC, issued a full award notice for the engineering, procurement, and construction contractor, which has been approved, Aqua added.
This is, I guess they got all the finances in order earlier in the year, in March and May, maybe, so they got, 8.4 billion in financing, 23 banks and investment firms. So they got the money in order. They've obviously, Aqua is a lead contractor. I think Larsen & Toubro, which is an Indian company, is going to come in and work underneath them. All this is going on Oxagon, which I think is interesting. You try and find out where things are going to end up and what their niche will be, what their primary thing. But this is going to be cited on Oxagon. The hero in all this, if you ask me, is Air Products. Air Products, which is, and we should give them more love, this is a U.S. firm founded in 1940 in Detroit, now headquartered in Pennsylvania. $13 billion annual revenue. By the way, the chairman, president, chief executive officer, Saifi Ghassemi, I'm sure I didn't pronounce that correctly, was born in Iran. And I say that because it's interesting how it all goes on. But the reason they're the hero is here, so you can do all this. You can invest all this money. The issue is offtake. Who's going to buy it? And so many hydrogen projects globally are, in theory, or moving ahead, but they don't have an offtake agreement. And Air Products has what's really made this possible. And essentially, that's what the CEO of Neom Green Hydrogen Company has said, is that Air Products has signed a 30-year offtake agreement. So they have a customer now. So there's reasons to go ahead with this. And the other cool thing of this is we know is the extraordinary amounts of renewable energy that's going to be put in place to make this possible. We're talking 2.2 gigs of renewable energy, over 5.6 million solar panels will be put in place to power this, which is the only reason you can call it green energy, green hydrogen, obviously, because it's, with its source of energy. So anyway, we should probably see if we can get Air Products on the show, because they're doing some good stuff. And it's important too, because we'll go back to the beginning. There's the discussion of, there's a Saudi Aramco model. By that, because the U.S. was so deeply involved with the development of the petroleum industry in Saudi Arabia, it ended up binding the countries together in many important tangible and intangible ways. Mm-hmm. A long-term, capital-intensive project that brought Saudis and Americans together. There are people who are, saying this is what would happen if we were to go fall in and engage on the nuclear front. Again, another long-term, capital-intensive partnership ties countries closer together. Air Products is doing this with hydrogen in Neom. Important, long-term U.S.-Saudi partnership. So I think maybe it should get more love than it does.
I agree. And I agree with it being the hero as well, Richard. We should get somebody from Air Products on to talk about it, especially now that it's all underway. So, they can sort of talk about how, give us some context on what's happening now that it's a done deal and the ink is dry.
Yeah.
Usually it's sensitive around that. So yes, join us, Air Products executive. Richard, let's put a bow on it, huh? This was a really good one for 94. We are only 6 away, by the way, from our centennial.
Triple digits.
That's
I think,
right.
as we said, as we talked about, if this were a sitcom, some people might think it is, don't you get syndicated at 100? But I think that's the case. I think we just keep plugging along, trying to make it big.
Or we will take a Lucid, which didn't have a good earnings reporting recently, but we'll still take one. They're only making $1,400 a quarter, but one of those can go to Richard, one of them can go to me, and we'll take that as a centennial gift. So anyway,
absolutely,
good stuff. Richard, thank you. See you next week.
Thank you, man.